very warm welcome to all of you from myself. Um, uh, um, our subject today is the development of land. And I will always remember more than 30 years ago as a young transport planner reading a quote from Sir Colin Buchanan about how valuable land is, one of the most valuable human assets that we must develop with care and look after for future generations. That was a big lesson to me as a transport planner, as I said, but we're going to hear about land today, as well as, and that will take us on to stewardship, how to look after land, develop land and quality developments so that they are maintained in the future. To tell us more about both land and stewardship, we have two fantastic speakers. We're going to start with the stewardship element, and that is going to be delivered by Ben Bolgar, who is a director of Stockbridge Land, as well as a director of the Princess Foundation. Ben has worked on the design of many new settlements over the last 20 or so years. And in 2016, Ben authored Building a Legacy, a landowner's guide to popular development, and that generated a huge amount of debate. Subsequently, and along with Gail Mayhew and Charlie Dugdale, Ben set up the Stewardship Initiative, which is supported by a large number of landowners, including the Church of England. Ben will outline his journey with different case studies. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Andres. And I will see whether I can share my screen. So let me know if it's working.
Yeah, I can see that.
Is that okay? Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll set my stopwatch so I don't drone on for too long. So this is a bit of a journey, actually, more about the stewardship structure in this talk than the case studies, because I haven't got too long, but I'll try and sort of talk a little bit about what we thought we can't actually seem to. Here we go.
Whilst you're doing that, Ben, can I remind the audience to give us their questions, comments during the presentations on the chat box, and I will be picking them up and then putting them to the two speakers at the end of the presentations. Sorry, Ben, please carry on.
Thanks, Andres. So in 2019, and I'm sure most people will be familiar with this document, I sat as an advisor on the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, bit of a mouthful. And even though the exam question that was really set by the minister was if all new houses look beautiful, everyone would vote for them and they'd get planning much quicker, which was maybe perhaps slightly oversimplified. The people who sat on that commission, a lot of us engaged in development ended up in a really, really fruitful and interesting debate about the business model behind housing. And actually, the late Sir Roger Scruton, when we gave him a list of projects to go and visit, he set off with Nicholas Boy-Smith and others to go around and look at these so-called exemplar developments. And I remember it really well. He came back and he said, well, there's some quite nice houses, but none of them have got any centres. And I think that stimulated debate about what do we mean by beauty? Was beauty merely skin deep? Was it to do with a nice facade? And was it to do with proportions? Or was it actually to do with the community? And if so, and I think we were erring towards, it's obviously both, but the community is essential to the feeling of beauty that one gets out of a place, as is the landscape. And that would only be engendered, or is most usually engendered, by mixed use, mixed income, walkable places rather than monocultural housing estates. So a certain element, really led by Gail and supported by myself, and then later Charlie Dugdale from Knight Frank, who carried out the research, really started to drill into this whole idea of what was actually, why were some of these exemplars, really successful, and why were some other exemplars with the same aspirations less so? So that's really where we sort of got into it. Again, you'll know that the three tenets, ask for beauty, refuse ugliness, or look for environmental net gain. But stewardship was one of the three major elements outlined in that Living with Beauty report, albeit I think it was probably the most complex, it was the most multidisciplinary, and so therefore it wasn't the low-hanging fruit that got the sort of focus of attention in the years that followed. Nevertheless, as I'll sort of come on to, myself, Charlie and Gail, pretty much in our spare time, actually started to make some good, have some good conversations with a number of people and try and push this forward as much as we could. And really it was about, you know, about long-term investment. It's about a patient investment perspective, and sort of therefore, how could you reconfigure land and the business model to actually incentivize good behavior and long-term behavior, rather than incentivizing the flogging off of land in the short term for the maximum profit. So it was turning everything on its head, effectively. Charlie Dugdale, this actually came out, these two reports, which if you haven't read them, you can Google them on Knight Frank's website and find them. They really are worthwhile. And one of them, Cost and Value, builds on, I'd written a document studying as case studies Poundbury and Fairford Lees, which had slightly different delivery models, but both with similar aspirations. And then Charlie took those, updated the data in cost and value terms, and added 8 more case studies. So that has 10 case studies, I believe, from memory, that he drills into in terms of, you know, does quality and the sort of things we're talking about in better placemaking, does it pay? Well, I think the conclusions are, for the most part, yes, if you take that perspective. And then building in beauty is very interesting, because it sort of takes almost the hurdles, the barriers to success, and it says, right, these are all the things that are disincentivizing the right types of behavior. And then he invents a kind of case study and then talks through an alternative business model. So again, a lot of this stuff is a bit beyond my pay grade, because it involves tax planning and funding structures, but it's very well written and sort of relatively easy to understand, even for design people like myself. Essentially, as I was saying, the sort of basic tenets behind it is that you know, if you can get longer term capital, that one of the problems in the market is, even with Homes England funding, you know, sort of 10 to 15 years, some of these settlements like Nan Sledden that I've worked on with the Duchy, that's a 40 to 45 year build out. So it's difficult to find money that is interested in patiently sitting around and investing in housing for that length of time. Sustainable development is obviously massively more, the value is not just in housing, the value is in all of these slightly less tangible things, like the value of community. We've just done some research at Oxford University on health, and there's some incredibly impactful research that we've gathered there about the benefits between creating walkable places and walkable neighborhoods. So health, I think, is obviously something that's becoming increasingly important, particularly in the over 70s. Just to give you an anecdote, and when the Prince of Wales wrote the foreword, he focused in on this one because he's now gone beyond 70. But 1 hour walk a day in the over 70s reduces the risk of serious disease by 70%. So of the top 5 serious diseases. So keeping mobile, particularly in old age, while going about your daily needs is really, really valuable. The local economic capture, I'll come on to some stats in relation to Poundbury, but you know, if you can use local builders, small to medium sized builders, if you can engender the right type and build the right type of affordable business space, then it's quite astounding how much impact you can have on the local and regional economies. And I think one of the other things we all know is that if you're in a business model that looks at the house on its own and says, right, what's the best unit type that gives me the best return on my investment, then you end up with a monocultural offer of houses between 750 and 1100 to 1200 square feet, rather than saying, all right, the Muse house or the big house with the high ceilings on the high street, they don't make much commercial sense on their own, but they're all part of building at a certain scale a place, and that place has value. So how one begins to look at the value of place, because of course, in our view, a diversified housing market and a diversified place equals a diversified community, and that is what you need to create something of great resilience and great value. So again, I'm sure all these things are fairly familiar with you all, and not exactly rocket science, but they are certainly not the way most places in the UK end up getting delivered. So when the first lockdown came, which was, goodness, what was it? last year in March or something like that, the benefit was we all got online, as I'm sure everyone had Zoom overload, and we just, the Living with Beauty report was, I think, done at the end of January from memory last year. So we suddenly set about sending all our documents that we'd collated. We spent a month doing a lot more work on the tax side. We had help from Safri's and others. We met with some fairly senior bankers and looked at what the appetite in the market was for 25 plus year investments, et cetera, and then having got our paperwork together, which was sent off to various ministers and various departments, and we had Zoom calls with some fairly senior people, we then reached out to our collective networks, who either had settlement or development that we thought was sort of along the right lines, either in the local plan or had planning consent. And literally within 3 weeks, we had soft commitments, like written letters of commitment on their letterhead, prepared to sign up to this non-existent stewardship initiative with its stewardship kite mark, which was set out in draft. And we were blown away by that, because the fact that we had pretty much covered every region in the UK and got soft commitments from landowners representing 165,000 homes, we just decided to stop. We didn't feel that we needed any more than that. And in the meantime, I run an annual event called Building a Legacy, which is for major landowners, not just the big estates, but church commissioners are part of it and others, and bus companies, brownfield sites, etc. And there's a real buzz beginning to emerge now about people wanting to do things very, very differently. And so what we're trying to do is ramp up our activities to share more knowledge, have more sites that people can go and visit, speak to the landowners, hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And again, we're also, maybe over optimistically, but we're beginning to see change from within places like Homes England, as people have been getting in touch and talking about this thing called stewardship. So we're sort of, fairly optimistic, albeit we don't really have much resource to do much. So the basic areas that Charlie identified that we sort of zoned in on, is that trust is really, really important. Those of you that have been involved in planning, there's virtually nothing to stop people watering down commitments at the point of planning. So how do you get that long-term commitment to improving development over time, rather than constantly nibbling away at the margins? Tax, it's outside my pay grade, but again, this idea is just not incentivized. When Charlie's talking to various landowners, it seems to be easier to buy another farm and stick things offshore than it does to actually, stick around for long term and invest. The funding, how can you plug the different funding gaps and incentivize people for that development trajectory that tends to become more valuable the more you build, if you're building a place? And then obviously, how do you create different targets within different departments that incentivize that good behavior? So these are all things that we've drilled into. People are probably sick to death about hearing people talking about Poundbury, but it is a good example of a long-term stewardship model. Obviously, the Duchy had the land, which helps massively, was able to afford to take it through the planning process. It did go straight into recession, so it wasn't exactly without its issues early on in the development, but they stuck with it. And I think, the fact that there are now 2,300 jobs for 1,700 homes, it puts 105 million, or just over 100 million, into the regional economy every year, GVA annually, is pretty outstanding. And 50% of those businesses are startups, and a majority by women. So this sort of small scale affordable space is not only what gives the place vibrancy and life, but it enhances the economy, but it's also now what's engendering car reduction, because 30% of the people who are working there actually live there. So it's having huge impacts around walkable communities and places. We've taken this work further. This was, I think, from one of Charlie's Knight Frank's reports on stewardship, and it looks at the land uses with Poundbury, and then another one, Elton Heath, and we begin to attach values to that. We then met with the Tim Stoner of Space Syntax, and then the Knight Frank geospatial team, and have developed a walkability tool to actually start to see what's going on with existing and new settlements, and just how many places are being granted consent in the name of sustainable development that we don't actually believe are at all. And then how does one get this virtuous circle of good behavior? How do you convince and incentivize landowners to put land in as equity? How do you incentivize, how do you convince the Treasury to help underwrite this, a different tax regime where you're actually, assembling land is so difficult in terms of people getting hit with big tax bills when they haven't even had any income. And again, how do you share, how through that partnership, if you've got a partnership between the landowner, the developer, etc., and potentially even third parties sectors, how do you then incentivize those people to go into partnership arrangements so that everybody wins and that everybody has the same incentives to build a better place? So I think I'm pretty much running out of time, but I think that the long and short of it is that the structure is that we believe is this, is that there's a stewardship kite mark. If you Google the stewardship initiative, you can see the draft kite mark there, but essentially it's a series of standards. If you're prepared as a landowner to voluntarily sign up to those independently audited kite marks, then you would get access to cheap money, essentially to long-term cheap capital. Through an investment fund. You would ideally, if we can get that far, be incentivized by a tax wrapper, a different tax regime, and that should in the marketplace have unbelievable traction and be very, very attractive to local authorities in the way that Duchy of Cornwall is now down in Newquay is so trusted that it's got the first big local development order, so it's eventually become its own planning authority. And so that's the ideal situation, is that you build trust, you have an independent body that's insulated from short-term and long-term politics, that builds a track record on the places that it delivers, and then you essentially try and create the right kind of disruption in the market. So again, I haven't got time to go into these, but we were just talking earlier, Kathie, about Torna Grain, near where you're based, with the Earl of Murray, is doing some pretty fantastic stuff in not a massively valuable market up there. Nansledden, the Duchy started off, they were selling, Persimmon, I think, were selling houses for $220 a square foot. They're now up to $330, $340, and there's a worry that too much success actually makes things unaffordable. So there's all sorts of amazing learning, but Cornwall Council are now becoming partners in this to deliver the main streets and the infrastructure. There's Steadings, I think, in Cirencester, Lord Bathurst is again breaking the mold, and so with Wellbourne Garden Village near Fareham in Hampshire are. So that we believe now there's the sort of growing portfolio of some of these places, all in different markets, all slightly different models, but actually, we think that the time is rife for a different business model to underpin housing. And I've just run over my 15 minutes, so sorry, Kathie, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ben. What a fantastic journey. I look forward to discussing that later on, after our second speaker has given us her presentation, and that's Cathy Pollard, who is a policy and practice lead at the Scottish Land Commission. I have to say, I, for one, know very little about the Scottish Land Commission, so I look forward to hearing about that work. Cathy has a background in planning policy, and she has worked with a range of stakeholders, including local authorities, third sector organizations, and different communities. Obviously, Cathy will tell us about the Land Commission's work and how land is managed in order to deliver wider public benefits. Over to you, Cathy.
There we go. Can you see the screen without notes, ideally?
That's right. Yes, you're ready to go.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's been already a really interesting start to the session. My name's Cathy Pollard. As Andrea said, I'm a policy and practice lead at the Scottish Land Commission. As I was preparing for this session, there were several approaches to this, and I was wondering what would be of most benefit to everyone today. Ooh, that's sped ahead. And I think that talking a little bit about the Land Commission, our approach, and how land rights and responsibilities and good stewardship can play a role in investing in good places would be a really helpful way to start. and actually explaining the role of land reform and the Land Commission in delivering this would perhaps be of interest. And then I'll focus on a few different areas in relation to policy and practice, and how this works. And I've got David Stewart in the audience, who's been working on land housing and development, who can go into more case studies if needed, but hopefully I'll give you just a flavour for what we've been working on. So just a little bit about land reform, actually, at the very beginning. So as probably all of you know, land comprises over half of the UK's 10.2 trillion net worth. So therefore, the way in which it's owned, used and managed is really important. Land ownership and use is fundamental to realising the opportunities for delivering healthy and dynamic environments, economies, and the communities that we want. So this is where balancing land rights and responsibilities and thinking about land in the longer term public interest is crucial. And I think it's important to stress that land reform isn't just about rural Scotland, but it's very much about urban Scotland as well. And hopefully some of the case studies today can illustrate that. I want to just briefly touch on this because I think the latest Planning Act in Scotland of 2019 really highlights the need for good stewardship. They introduced the purpose of planning, which is to manage the development and use of land in the long-term public interest. And the previous acts, the Land Reform Act and the Community Empowerment Act, also continue this line of thinking about responsible land ownership and use, and bringing communities into it as well. So who is the Land Commission? The 2016 Land Reform Act set up a non-departmental public body, the Land Commission. We're based in Inverness, to think differently about the way in which we own, use and manage land, and to progress the land reform agenda. We have 6 Scottish Land Commissioners who guide our work. There's a small team of 15 of us that are thinking about new policy and practice, and also legislative ways that we can improve the way in which land is owned, used and managed. And our vision is a fair, inclusive and productive system of ownership, management and use of land that delivers greater benefit for all the people of Scotland. And this, sorry, I keep skipping, there we go. And this is our current work stream, these 3 areas. I won't cover them in great detail, but I'll just give you a flavour for what we're looking at the moment. So the first is around reforming land rights, and we're looking at the way in which land rights and ownership are controlled to drive economic, social and environmental value, to strengthen community resilience and reduce inequalities. And we're focusing here in particular on rural repopulation, ensuring that land is more easily available for housing and infrastructure, and increasing community ownership of land and buildings. Community wealth building will be a really important part of this work as well. The second area of work is reforming land markets. So here we're looking at a range of ways to approach land valuation. We're looking at the role of tax in land markets, and we're looking at how to create a more public interest-led approach to development. And I'll touch on this in a little while. And the third area of work is related to accountability and responsibility. And here the aim is to make sure that whoever owns or uses land is doing it in a way in which that is more responsible and accountable to local communities and the public benefit. And this work stream, more than any other, is about implementing something called the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit about what this means. The Land Rights and Responsibility Statement is the first of its kind in the world, actually, in terms of setting out the relationship between land reform and human rights, and recognising that along with rights to land come responsibilities to your neighbours, your community and the wider public good. And the Land Commission has developed a series of protocols to help bring these principles to life and realise what they might look like in practice. We have a head of land rights and responsibilities who's overseeing this area of work, and we lead training and development across different land sectors with different landowners, communities, etc., to help share and deliver good practice. And we'll continue to do this over the course of the next few years, and we're really keen to look at how this statement could be mainstreamed within public policy, operations for local authorities, and responsible businesses to conduct policies of the private sector. But what does it mean? There's so many different interests and sectors. I think it's really important to agree on a common understanding. And for us, it means stewardship means the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. So in relation to land activities, this means complying with existing policy and regulation, demonstrating the longer term impact and also the benefits of land on the environment and people, and also considering the wider public benefit. So with this in mind, I'm just going to briefly touch on a few areas where I think we can see this realised in particular. I think vacant and derelict land, brownfield land, has been a major priority for the Land Commission. And I think here you can see that good stewardship of land, or potentially bad stewardship of land, can lead to a significant impact on communities. And actually good stewardship in this area can lead to greater investment in places and support placemaking. So just a little bit about the issue of vacant derelict land in Scotland. There's about just over 10,000 hectares of vacant derelict land in Scotland. That's about 2 times the size of Dundee. A third of the Scottish population lives within about 500 metres of a vacant derelict site, and that increases in areas of multiple deprivation. So in order to address this, the Land Commission, together with the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, set up a vacant derelict land task force to help strategically address this issue. And they came up with 13 recommendations to address the existing issue of vacant derelict land in Scotland, but also to look at ways to prevent a new legacy of vacant derelict land from being created, essentially turning off the tap. And I think this is where responsible land reuse and the principle of good stewardship really comes into its own. And we're working with a variety of landowners across the public and private sector to embed this in practice. But I think key here, there's several recommendations outlined on the slide here, but key is to make it unacceptable for land to be left derelict or vacant indefinitely. So essentially this is about proactive estate management practices and embedding that into corporate social responsibility. And linked to that, we're thinking that public funding should only be given to responsible landowners. So really encouraging that reuse element. These are just some of the examples for how this might work in a vacant and derelict land context. And I just thought I'd highlight this case study of Baltic Street Playground in Glasgow, because it also shows that there are different models of stewardship. And this is a community that's taken over a derelict site in Glasgow and created an outdoor learning, an outdoor classroom. It's a playground on a previous, I think it was originally Commonwealth Games site, but really they saw the longer term benefits and potential of this site. And so stewardship can take many different forms, but I think it's just an important example of what could be done if we realise good stewardship in practice. Recently, the Liverpool City Region Land Commission, England's first land commission, had produced a report with a set of recommendations that also recognised the issue of brownfield sites and land vacancy and the impact this can have on communities. So the report suggested that there should be, again, a principle recognising that land shouldn't be left vacant for an indefinite period of time, and that an industry charter for responsible land ownership could be really helpful in this context. So this is a package of recommendations that Steve Rotherham is now looking to implement and take forward. Moving on to another area of policy, hopefully I've got a few minutes left. This is a major piece of work for us, and we've just come to the end and published the findings of a review of land for housing. So we realised that there's a shortage of affordable homes of different, providing different needs for where people want to live and work. We're not delivering enough homes to meet that demand. And obviously in the last few years, we've seen an increased need to deliver better places that deliver wider health outcomes. We also have a climate emergency, so the need to locate development near public infrastructure that support climate and biodiversity benefits as well would be key. So how do how did we deliver this next step of how did we deliver this work? Well, we undertook a range of different research projects looking at European examples of how land comes forward for development for housing. We undertook stakeholder engagement, and we produced a set of recommendations late in the summer that really suggested 5 different ways, and I won't go into the recommendations in detail now, but 5 different ways to move from a more speculative house building model, which is the dominant model in Scotland, to a more proactive, longer term focus of housing delivery. And I guess the link to good stewardship in all of this is that we believe that reform needs to be incremental, that we can't introduce all these things at one point, but really that we should start with surplus public sector land and reusing that, and so having that longer term approach to land reuse. We also think that as part of the realising good stewardship, a proactive approach to land management practices should be embedded. And in order to do this, I think as Ben touched on as well, it's a collaborative approach. We need to be working across the public, private and third sector to realise this. And there's a few examples that I think illustrate this much better than just the policy level. This is a case study from Glasgow, from Anderson, where the Glasgow City Council had worked together with Scottish Government and a housing association to proactively regenerate the area. And this is a great example of a housing-led regeneration project that had undertook detailed master planning, undertook intensive community engagement, and took a patient capital approach for site assembly and delivery. It's another excellent example of partnership working. And I suppose the key message here is that all these elements demonstrate a willingness and a longer term view to bring this vacant site back into use.
Kathie, 1 minute, please.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sure. The second case study is Dalgavel in Renfrewshire, which was a former BAE Systems owned site. And I'll just summarise very quickly here. What was very interesting in this approach is that BAE Systems took on the development of this site during the recession, when the original house builder had walked away from this. So rather than just leaving it empty and derelict, it took on this ambitious project, introduced infrastructure to unlock development land, and delivered a really, really good example of placemaking. Again, you can find the case studies on our website. But really what I hope to do is show you that a longer term approach to land development and introduce good stewardship creates value. We need to take a holistic approach to land use decisions, and all of this can support better placemaking. And a very wee plug for me at the end. If you want to find out more, we've got our conference next week, so please do find out a little bit more about all of this at our conference. Thanks.
Kathie, thank you so much. You've gone a little bit over the time, but we will forgive you because it was all very, very interesting. The only problem we have now, there are loads of questions, so let's see if we can do justice to everybody. I'm going to start with David Duerden, who has asked not one, but maybe 2 or 3 different questions. David, would you like to put your points across, please? Is David there?
Yeah, sorry, I was just reaching for my unmute button. Apologies.
Okay, fire away.
Yeah, fire away. Thank you very much. I mean, I guess one of the issues I've got is in Gloucester is we're totally signed up to the idea of long-term stewardship. And I suppose the first question would be, where's the evidence that we can give to our public sector partners, adult social health care commissioners, health commissioners, about the very real, tangible, benefits they get? Because we're really struggling to get hold of that. And I suppose the second really important point I wanted to ask about is, how do we bake in affordability into this work? Ben talked about this in his presentation, which is that we create these great communities and then the market value of them goes up because everyone wants to be there. How do we make sure that local, dare I say, local people on median wages, get a slice of these great communities as well? So I think those are the two meaty questions I suppose I've got for you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Ben, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, I couldn't agree more about the lack of evidence, and that's what we're going to try and do with the Building a Legacy group. Is I was asked by our landowning group to try and collect evidence. So on the Prince's Foundation website, there's a report called The Value of Community, which is the two case studies I talked about, Bedford, Leeds and Poundbury, and that was with Savills and the University College of Estate Management, and that looks at the actual uplift in values over time of different housing types in those two different places, and then has about nearly 1,000 questionnaires from people to find out what they value socially about living in a particular place. And then Charlie Dugdale, the two reports that I pinged up there, Cost and Value and Building and Beauty, more case studies. I'm happy if people want to email Andreas to share the health reports that we did with Oxford University.
That would be good. Yep.
It's hopefully going to be published referenced in a magazine next month. So don't circulate it too widely, but I'm sure it's fine if you just want to read it. But I completely agree. I think what we need to do, particularly to convince not just other landowners, but particularly the public sector, we're trying to convince DIO at the moment on one of their big sites exactly this. And we need more evidence. We need more evidence about the health impacts. We need to study what the trip internalization rates are, because it's only, I think, when we have better evidence that trustees of landed estates or public sector will be convinced and be able to make those decisions. So that's,
Okay.
that. Just very quickly on affordability again, this is a problem, isn't it? I mean, you see in London that the best places which have a local market, nice housing stock, good looking houses, flexibility, they're just crazily expensive because there are also other areas that aren't as nice, so you get these spikes in desirability. If the whole country started to produce stewardship, you'd still have differences in land value, but you probably have less spiking that would occur because one place is particularly more successful than another. And the other, so that's one thing. I think we need more of it to balance the market. But the second thing is, obviously, if you buy in a community that's got better public space and better park provision and whatever, and more generous windows so that the proportions and feeling of space and light are better, you don't always need a bigger house. So sure, you can go for your budget, you can go down the road and buy a 4-bedder from a house builder, or you could come to one of the stewardship settlements and buy a 3-bedder. There are, as long as you've got a good housing mix, and as long as you've got good proportions, as long as you've got good public space, having ensuite bathrooms in every house, I don't think is necessarily the driver. So, but it is an issue. So I'd say those two things, more of the good stuff.
Thank you, Ben. Yep. Thank you. I don't know if Kathie wants to add anything before we go to the next question.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a few thoughts on particularly relating to how do you demonstrate the added value of a project. I think we came across this issue in relation to bringing derelict land back into use, and where the market isn't delivering, how do you facilitate that investment and that prioritization, for example, within a local authority. And what we did was produce a tool that complements existing guidance such as the Scottish Finance Manual, the HM Treasury's Green Book, and it looks at assessing and quantifying the wider benefits of bringing this land back into use through what we call the National Performance Framework, which is the Scottish Government national outcomes sort of priority list, and we look at where this project would meet those different criteria. So, for example, with the Baltic Street Playground, it would look at education, health, and various other elements that would meet those requirements that you're constantly linking into national priorities, and that's how local authorities can then support that intervention on that site. And I think we also need to look at what the community needs are, and engaging with communities adds a lot of value to the process, and that can help potentially de-risk a project. Again, it's not always possible to quantify this, but we have done research to look at the sort of the business case and the added value of engaging communities really early on in the process before development takes place. So hopefully that adds something.
Thank you, Cathy. I'm just hurrying you a little bit. I wanted to go to the next. I think, Jonathan Brooks, your question has already been answered by Ben on the chat. So I'm going to jump and go to Nicholas Falk. Nick, you have a question on land trusts. Would you like
yes,
to?
Thank you, Andres. I wanted to raise the question of the role that community-based development trusts or community land trusts can play in the development of major schemes, both to reduce conflict, but also to achieve wider benefits. For example, a trust that levied a charge on car parking could then use the return to fund electric bikes. This was the sort of thing that we envisaged when we were working on Northstowe and proposed a development trust. And I think the sort of practices that you find commonplace in Europe, where the community building is as important almost as house building, can also be relevant in Britain. So I just wondered, Ben, what your approach was to endowing a community-based project. I realize that may be at the expense of your landowner clients, and perhaps I'm talking about a different approach to development.
Okay, thank you.
No, I completely agree, Nicholas. I'm not an expert on CLTs, but I have explored them with people that are, and I think they're a great model, because if people have land and you can put that land into a trust and engage the community in how that land is used, then obviously you're right, you engender a greater sense of ownership. I know that at Upton in the early days, the local authority wouldn't adopt the sustainable urban drainage systems, and then the legislation never came about that was supposed to come about, and then the Lands Trust took on the management of the green infrastructure and put up the bills for everybody, which wasn't particularly popular at the time. So I think, and then the Dutchy experience at Poundbury is that you had some quite, bright retired people, busy bodies who were managing the mancos, and it all got a bit much. They had too many of them and it caused a bit of friction. So I think that you're absolutely right, and I'm sure got more experience than me in these things, but particularly with energy optimization coming over the hill and drainage systems and all of that, if you can find a mechanism by which the land is endowed in the right way for long-term stewardship and involving the community in that, then I think that's got to be the right way forward, as long as it's well managed, obviously.
Does anybody know of any such trusts that are in use at the moment anywhere, either in the UK or overseas? I'm asking the speakers as well as the audience if anybody would like to jump in, and I will leave that. Yep. Cathy?
Yeah, I think there's lots of examples of community-owned assets and land in Scotland. The Community Empowerment Act and Land Reform Act have made that possible. So this is where communities are taking on ownership. But I'd also just like to raise the point of community wealth building, which doesn't necessarily mean outright ownership of assets, but it's really ensuring that the communities are involved in every part of realizing and sort of capturing the wider benefits, and they go right back to the community in the way that land is owned and used. So that's work that's ongoing within the Scottish Government. We're actually looking at a Community Wealth Building Act. So all I can say is watch this space. But there was another issue related to that, which would be really interesting to get your views on as well, is how do we ensure that there's land available for communities to take ownership of, and what are the barriers to ensuring that communities can do that and feel empowered and resourced to do so?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Cathy.
Andreas, I can answer the question. Yeah, there are quite a few trusts in the UK where that model is being adopted. A good example maybe sort of Chatham Maritime, for example, where endowed with quite a lot of assets, but also actually that leads into the question that I wanted to ask, which I think builds on this anyway, which is around the funding. And if either speakers had a position really in terms of ideal policy. I set up quite a number of stewardship trusts across the UK, and what I generally find is that the developers are seeking to maximize the land values from their own perspective, and the local authorities are seeking to extract maximum value for the infrastructure around roads or schools or social housing or whatever, and therefore both parties are generally prepared to put as much as possible back onto the residents, so they're paying not only council tax but also estate management charges or whatever for these placemaking strategies. I think we started to answer that question just now about endowments versus other income streams, such as Nicholas mentioned, like car parks or energy strategies or telecommunication and so on. There are various ways, but they don't necessarily guarantee the long term, because this have to work in perpetuity. So I just wondered if Ben or Cathy had a particular policy view at how they'd like to see this funded. That's the revenue cost, not the capital cost. The revenue costs of maintaining the infrastructure, public open spaces, facilities, and the placemaking agenda that needs to be an ongoing basis in the long term. I wonder if they had any views on that.
Very good question. Thank you, Mark. So, which of our speakers would like to jump in first?
I don't mind. Again, it's not my area of expertise. I think ideally it would be a blend. I think, you know, a management charge to pay for the basics is appropriate, but I've had some conversations with some quite interesting developers and individuals about energy optimization, you know, and actually building, you know, providing energy at source, for instance, and also allowing creative ways for the use of land that generates an income within that community over time, I think is important. So I think what is needed is more good case studies, more research, and more sharing of that knowledge, so that again, in the stewardship's mind, that is set out from the beginning. The long-term estate management through a community management trust or similar needs to be established at the outset with a strategy of how that's going to be funded in the long term.
But is that something that Charlie Dugdale may be able to give us more information on, Ben, do you think? Or so I can put Mark and Charlie in touch?
He might well be able to, yeah.
No.
I've just posted a link. You know, there are quite a few groups, and I've spoken to the people at the Community Lands Trust. There are an increasing number of I think models and examples of this.
Yeah. Okay, Kathie, would you like to add anything to this point?
This is probably a bit cheeky, but I would just suggest coming along to our conference next week. This will be no, seriously, these events will be addressing exactly that issue of how do communities benefit from, for example, what's happening in terms of natural capital and the drive to sequester carbon, tree planting, renewable energy. How do we create these different models that ensure that communities can also benefit economically from that? So this is all the subject for discussion next week. But I'd just like to stress that Scotland has the Scottish Land Fund that also supports communities with acquisition of ownership, and we have different funds available in relation to vacant and derelict land, where the need is to work together and collaborate with local authorities to access that funding. So there are different streams available, but I suppose in the longer term, yeah, taxation, I know taxation's been mentioned in the chat, may have a role, and that's something the Land Commission is looking at as well, as how the land tax system could be used to deliver wider outcomes in relation to land.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, Kathie, how much communication is there between the Scottish Land Commission and any equivalent agency in England? And would you say that you are ahead of us in Scotland?
Well, as I said, the Liverpool City Regional Land Commission was the first land commission in England recently, but other than events such as this, I don't think there is an equivalent agency. Certainly have not come across that, but other than events such as this, I think in terms of UK government, we share our expertise and experience informally.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next speaker, even though I have to say I can't pronounce the name. It's about CPOs. So is that Aidan?
Aidan, hi.
Aidan, sorry.
That's all right. I was just curious how the vacant and derelict properties are actually brought back into use in Scotland, if there's legislation to support that, or is it through CPO or something else?
That's a really good question. So there's several legislative options that we've considered and we've put forward as part of the Vacant Direct Land Task Force recommendations. And yes, compulsory purchase orders is part of that package, but I'd like to introduce compulsory sales orders as an idea. And this is where an inactive landowner has a property that is blighting the community for an indefinite period of time. And this power would allow a community to, would allow a local authority to bring the site forward for an auction. And the auction would start at zero. So therefore the price offered on the day would reflect the market value essentially of the site. So those are the sort of primary ideas for that power. The Land Commission developed proposals for this. They're now with Scottish Government, and we're looking forward to seeing when they'll be introduced in the next parliamentary period.
Thank you. An easier name to pronounce next is Michael. Michael Ward. Would you like to put your question, please?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, my question was based around the examples that were shown in the presentation, like Poundbury and Torney Grain, where you have a sort of benevolent landowner or part of the landed gentry who's promoting these schemes. Whereas in the sort of, I work in Glasgow City Council, and I think the biggest challenge we face, along with many other local authorities, is how we perform simple maintenance and stewardship routines based on the cuts that we've had. So we're going to end up with a sort of two-tier approach to stewardship, where we have small pockets of very well stewarded and looked after places set against significant areas where the steward in effect is the local authority who can no longer afford to carry out that role. Probably not an easy one to answer, but I'm just wondering what the panel's thoughts on that are.
Thank you. Ben, you touched on the spikes, didn't you, during your presentation?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and not an easy one to answer, as you say. But it just seems to me, obviously my background's more on the design side, but it does feel, you know, one of the recommendations that I didn't touch on that came out of the Building Better Commission was, you know, if you look at how disjointed both local and national government are. I mean, when you're designing a place, you know, you've got the rural integration between the urban and the rural, you've got housing, you've got infrastructure, you've got business space, you know. So the fact that there isn't an interdepartmental, you know, BAYS, DEFRA, Department for Transport, Homes and Communities, or whatever it's now called, Levelling Up, you know, they're not talking to each other. And one of the recommendations, and maybe this is something Michael Gove will actually do with his, you know, because the Duchy of Lancaster, as far as I understand it, had some interdepartmental remits. It seems as if this Levelling Up remit has an interdepartmental thing. And I just think, you know, it's all about maximizing efficiencies, isn't it? If you want to get good public-private sector investment, you want efficiencies of scale, you know. And when you look at good highways design and maintaining roads, you know, it's extraordinary. When you go to Poundbury, there's no road signs, you know, very little, you know, all right, the gravel annoys a few people, but, you know, the amount, when you see what's being spent in some of these places by the public sector on sort of endless, you know, heavily engineered solutions, it's not very efficient. And I think the efficiencies come through better coordination between the different departments. And so I would say, you know, and let's look at the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, I would say if you use SDG 11, Sustainable Communities, as a way, as a focal point, both in regenerative terms and in new build terms, to bring together the different departments, then maybe you can get better efficiencies through that. But I agree, there is always an issue of short-termism, you know, outside an electoral cycle and outside a performance monitoring regime. How do you justify, you know, spend over the long term in the way that a landed estate would, because they know they might be holding some of the assets for hundreds of years.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock. We are fast running out of time, but we have time for one more question, and I think that's Andrew Purvis about land value tax appropriately. Yes, Andrew?
Thank you. I just wonder whether a universal, meaningful land value tax would bring vacant land into use, reduce land prices, and impose a responsibility or an obligation on landowners.
Kathie,
Thanks for that question. This is something the Land Commission is looking at closely. We've considered sort of the potential of a land value tax in Scotland, and we're currently undertaking work and finalising advice to government on this issue. So watch this space. But I suppose there is a need to look differently at how we capture land values, and there may be a role for a land value tax. We already do that to some extent through business rates, but we need to look at other areas and other opportunities to perhaps capture some of the rising land values, particularly with changing markets in mind, looking at vacant derelict land and other areas. So again, sorry, I can't directly answer your question yet, but there is definitely work coming this way.
Would it help Andrew if he attended your conference next week?
Beautifully done, Andreas. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much to our two speakers, Ben and Kathie. I think you've given us lots of things to think about. You know, it's obviously land development and stewardship are very, very important, but it's interesting that we've only just scratched the surface, isn't it? We are all still learning how to maximize benefits from all this. And hopefully this event today will have got some of our members thinking about it a bit more, and will have contributed towards getting things right in the future. So thank you to everybody who attended. Thank you also to Kaylin behind the scenes, holding all of us in order. And can I wish you a good weekend, and I look forward to seeing you again at the next Urbanism Hour in a month's time. Thank you and goodbye.